Okay, so it is so lovely to see all your beautiful faces. Thank you so much for coming. I am going to talk a little bit about my book, The Monarchs of Winghaven, and then I'll read a passage from it. If you want to hear the beginning of the book, I read a little bit of it on WHMP this morning on Talk the Talk, so you can find that on their website under their saved podcasts. So nature was a huge part of my life when I was a child and growing up. I was born in England, and I lived there till I was 5, and while I was there, my dad used to take my sister and me to the village square in the small village outside of London where we lived, and we would catch newts in the pond, and he would take us to the creek, and we would catch sticklebacks in the river. And then later, when I got a little older and we moved to the United States, I became passionate about bird watching, and I spent a lot of time on Audubon field trips and just traipsing around on my own, looking for birds and other natural creatures. And I also found at the end of our neighborhood this beautiful and unique place where I felt I could go alone to study nature, and I called it the field. It was basically an abandoned lot. It was a big meadow. There was shrubland on the sides, and sort of deep in the shrubland down in the valley, there was a pond that had muskrats and turtles and all kinds of pond invertebrates and cool things to look at. So the field really became my haven. And for me, it was really connected. It was always connected for me with the secret spaces we think about in children's literature that I think are formative for a lot of us. Places like Terabithia and the Bridge to Terabithia, or what's it, Sam Gribley's Oak Tree in My Side of the Mountain, which is just one of my favorite books of all time. If you've not read it, you must rush and read it. It's the best. Or even something like Narnia or those fantasy landscapes. So I loved the field. I took responsibility for it. I learned from it, and I filled my nature journals with my observations and my adventures there, whether it was seeing a skunk or spotting my first brown thrasher, or finding ant lions in the sand underneath the trees. So I think that all children deserve their own special place in nature that becomes their place. It's a place to really learn about their own belonging in nature and to discover their own position relative to the natural ecosystems that surround them. So I wrote this book about 2 kids, Sammy and Bram. Here they are on the cover. Here's a picture that I found on the internet that I always thought looked like Sammy. I always called her blonde as the sun and as the grassland. And there's one here that kind of looks like Bram, although it's a little young. This is a little boy at one of my nature center visits holding a monarch that we freed. And he's got brown hair and brown eyes like Bram, so that's a little bit like Bram. And so Sammy and Bram strike up a friendship in this special landscape that was inspired by the landscape where I grew up. And they start up a monarch counting project in this special space. And through that project, they're able to eventually fend off a development threat to this space. So my own field did eventually get torn down by development. It is no longer in my hometown where I grew up. But this book is my way of keeping that space alive. So I am going to share a little bit about Sammy and Bram with you now. Hey, I have an idea, said Bram one day. Let's bring a monarch egg home to my place. We can raise it into a butterfly. Sammy squinched her mouth up and her eyebrows down. We'd be taking it from its habitat, she said after a moment. But not forever, said Bram, just until it grows up. I read online about how to keep caterpillars. I can show you. Back at Winghaven, they chose a fat little egg with care. Gently, they plucked its milkweed stem and brought it back to Bram's in a plastic container with holes punched in the top, hoping they had picked one that would actually hatch. And it did, but for a couple of days, the caterpillar itself was so small that Bram and Sammy couldn't find it. Finally, they saw it lazily munching a milkweed leaf. Relief coursed through Sammy's insides like water returning to a dried-up forest creek after a rainstorm. Every day, they gave it fresh milkweed leaves. A moistened paper towel kept the habitat from drying out. At last, the caterpillar crawled to the top of the cage and hung itself from the wood on a tiny stalk of silk. There, it transformed into a bright green chrysalis. A couple of weeks later, the pupa slowly changed color from green to black. Bram promised that if the monarch began to emerge, he'd call Sammy right away. Oh, this is chapter 28, a couple chapters later. Launching. Ding! Sammy hastily opened her text messages. "Come quick," Bram had written. "I think the monarch is about to hatch." Soon, with a stitch in her side and legs aching, gasping for breath, Sammy zoomed into Bram's driveway. She dumped her bike and bounded upstairs. Bram and his mom were bent over the counter in the kitchen. "You're just in time, Sammy," said Vicky. The chrysalis had cracked open at the very bottom. Already a tiny black head was poking out. "Here it comes," whispered Bram. The creature wiggled. Then it squirmed, and the chrysalis split all the way open. The butterfly came out in a rush. It clung to the chrysalis with slender black legs, now a clear shell hanging from the wood. Its black body was shrunken and huge, was thickened and huge. Its patterned wings were shrunken and crumpled like a folded-up parachute. Now, Sammy knew, it had to pump fluid from its body into its wings. They watched for about 10 minutes as the wings stretched to their proper size, folded neatly above the butterfly's back. Its previously fluid-swollen body had become slender. Its antennae waved gently, testing the air. "I remember it takes a while before the butterfly dries and starts moving around," Vicky said. "You could probably hold it." Gingerly, Bram unlatched the mesh lid of the cage. He hesitated. Then he turned to Sammy. "I'm scared I'll hurt it," he said. "You're always picking up bugs. You first." Sammy reached under the lid. She touched the monarch's front feet with a careful forefinger. The monarch took one faltering step, then another and another, until all its legs rested on Sammy's skin. She couldn't think of anything more beautiful. Early the next day, the two kids stood solemnly at the top of the hillock, mesh cage in hand. Winghaven looked especially golden in the morning light. The day's first sun rays slanted through the thick wildflowers and made the grasses shine. Bram opened the cage. Then Sammy reached in and poked gently at the butterfly's feet. The butterfly fluttered nervously, batting at Sammy's hand. Then it launched itself out of the cage. They watched it sail over Winghaven. It teetered up and down in the air, then made a sudden beeline into the thick growth and vanished. Sammy felt a lump in her throat. They'd spent so much care and effort tending the small caterpillar, then watching over the pupa. Sometimes the smallest things are the strongest, she remembered Bram saying. Now it was up to their butterfly to protect itself against the huge world. So I'll stop there. I do hope you listen to Priya and read some middle grade literature because it is the best thing ever. I just love entering those little worlds of children. All right. And Brian is up.
Thank you, Naila. That was wonderful. I'd like to start with a guided imagery. You can close your eyes if you'd like or not. Naila talked about the field, that special place. Picture in your mind's eye a beautiful mountain. Perhaps it's a mountain quite near you that you can travel to often to hike or birdwatch or contemplate the universe. Perhaps it's a mountain elsewhere in the greens or the whites or out west or even in another country. Perhaps it's a mountain only in your imagination. But whatever and wherever it is beautiful. Stretching out into the sky, reaching out to touch the clouds, green in the summer, alive with color in the fall, sleepy in winter, and bursting with new life in the spring. A little bit of paradise, a sacred place, your beautiful mountain. Okay, you can open your eyes if you were closing them. I've written a book about two girls in West Virginia who love such a mountain. They call it Mount Tom. It's their mountain. As Cindy, the 15-year-old protagonist and narrator, writes in the book, it's the mountain we go to when we want to get away from the world and the crazies and my twit of a sister and Ashley's mother who drives her insane, when we can't decide what is true and what isn't, or why the world is the way that it is, or why boys do what boys do, or why zits just happen to pop out at all the wrong moments, or why whenever you wear a really cute short skirt, it always seems to get caught in your underwear after you pee, and you don't know it until people point and laugh. It's our special, sacred place, our church, our temple to the gods and goddesses. We make our way to the top, and we sit on the edge of the world, and we get a good, heavy dose of that old-time religion. So that's their mountain in the book. Go back to your mountain for a moment, if you will, your image of your mountain. Imagine how it would be if a coal company came to your sacred place, your little bit of paradise, and blew the top off of it. Literally blew the top off. Turned it into a shattered, lifeless moonscape. Imagine how you would feel. That's the action that my book revolves around. Sydney lives in the heart of coal country, West Virginia, where coal is king, and the coal company has plans to blow the top, literally blow the top off her mountain. Here's the passage that I'd like to read. This is, again, Cindy, the narrator, reading from the book Kaboom. Mountaintop removal. It was all the rage here in West Virginia, and come to find out, had been for years. Who knew? Obviously not Ashley and me. Picture this, a beautiful mountain blanketed in green, a West Virginia quilt of trees, trees and more trees, the who's who of the forest, hopping and scurrying and flying and buzzing and bounding from tree to awesome tree. Nature, awesome nature. A feast for the eyes, a sanctuary for the soul, a temple to the gods. Always had been and always would be. Until now. Until this. Mountaintop removal. Blow the top off of the mountain. I know, it sounds like some really lame action flick where a bunch of terrorist dudes cross the border and sneak into the country and start blowing shit up before Will Smith or Dwayne Johnson or Vin Diesel come and beat the crap out of them. But that's what the coal companies do. They cut down all the trees on top of a mountain, lay down tons of dynamite, and then kaboom! Hundreds of vertical feet on the summit of a mountain are blown sky high. Gone. Just like that. Goodbye paradise. The top of the mountain blasted apart, and all the rock and debris dumped to the side, bearing streams and valleys. It's like taking that forested quilt, that fabric of life, and tearing the middle right out of it. Rip out the heart, rip out the soul. To the coal company, it makes perfect sense. Why hire a bunch of locals to dig, and then dig some more when you can just cut to the quick and blow the whole thing up? It's much easier that way. Take the miner out of mining. More bucks for the bang. Of course, like Comedy Central said, keep it up and they'll just have to call us Billies because there won't be any more hills left to put us on. This had been going on for years throughout Appalachia, years. Now, Tom wasn't going to be the first to lose his head. Coal was king, and the emperor had a fierce appetite for beheadings. How could I not have known this? So again, that's the tension in my book. And can you imagine something like that happening to your special place? In Massachusetts here, Could you imagine a coal company and trying to blow the top off of one of our mountains? 10 years ago today, April 22nd, 2016, Tennessee Gas Pipeline Company's $5 billion Northeast Energy Direct project, which would have cut across 8 towns in Franklin County and then Plainfield here in Hampshire County, was canceled as a result of, quote, inadequate commitments from prospective customers. And it was the incredible activism, the hundreds, the thousands of people who worked for months to build opposition to a natural gas pipeline. So again, the tension in my book is, are they going to allow a coal company to blow up their bit of paradise, or are they going to stop something like that happening like we did 10 years ago with the natural gas pipeline?
I lived in eastern Kentucky, Brian, where that was a constant occurrence, the mountaintop removal. We probably all in this room would agree that our Earth is in trouble. We face a crisis of global warming, resulting in wild and destructive events threatening our environment in so many ways, including forcing people to leave their homes to escape the results. Writing fiction about our vulnerable planet is enormously challenging. Fiction rarely offers a blueprint for change, but it can inspire empathy and even activism. But how do we engage readers who haven't yet focused on the dangers to the environment? How do we elicit that empathy for the people, animals, plants already in dire situations? Each of us approaches this challenge in a different way for different readers. My new novel, Sometimes an Island, is a novel in stories. It takes place in the dozen or so years leading up to and following a massive climate disaster that changes everything, called The Great Undoing of 2029. I will say I wish I had pushed that off a little bit when I was writing this book. My choice in writing this book was to focus not on the disaster itself, but on the people who saw it coming or didn't, the people who survived and had to figure out what next. This novel has 14 narrators, including one ghost. The stories share settings, themes, and characters, but the 3 settings are really important in terms of linking these stories together. One setting is an island off the coast of Maine where Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia settled in the early years of the 20th century. An off-the-grid homestead in rural inland Maine where some of the island descendants settled over a century later, this time fleeing rising sea levels. And a collective in western Massachusetts living in a building suspiciously similar to Eastworks, with one member who ends up in prison convicted of eco-terrorism. To introduce you to the world of this novel, I'm going to read a section narrated by Sadie, great-granddaughter of one of those immigrants from the Pale of Settlement who settles on the island. As an older woman, Sadie moves to inland Maine and gathers friends and family to create an off-the-grid homestead. This section takes place 7 months after the Great Undoing. On the afternoon the two women arrived, Miriam napped, and I rested from the morning's garden work. My lap cradled a wicker basket of dead devices. Before the undoing, when guests entered the homestead, my husband and I collected all screens, phones and tablets and laptops. With no internet and only intermittent cell service, even back then, the electronics were of little use. Some days, Miriam was marginally coherent. She could help with peeling potatoes or sweeping the floor, perhaps provide a bit of conversation. On her good days, I'd set her up at the long pine table with her watercolors, and she would disappear into her memories, painting tiny portraits of the people we, had lost. This wasn't a good day. She hadn't said a word since waking up that morning. Sometimes I thought I'd perish from the silence. Our 20-acre homestead was conceived as a utopia by necessity. 8 years before the undoing, David and I moved here from our Penobscot Bay home to escape the disasters everyone knew would come. 30 miles of gravel road from the nearest town, this place was wild inland Maine, land of moose and white water. That life-changing event last November, when the Greenland ice cap cracked and crashed and the tsunami started the cascade of disasters, was the day of our annual fall excursion to Portland. Everyone remembers what happened to the global coastal cities that day. I don't know for certain that my family all perished, but must assume they did. In the early hours after the tsunami hit, we had news of the disasters, but then the grid failed and the internet collapsed. After the undoing, those of us who survived searched to find human connection, timidly, each bruised with loss, silent with grief. Without internet or electricity, media or mail, we could only imagine life beyond our small borders. Other survivors would have made their way home by now, wouldn't they? Or maybe not. Maybe they hunkered down somewhere, and now with warmer weather making travel easier, they are heading home. That hope sustains me and destroys me. Occasionally, strangers showed up at the homestead, a friend of a friend sent by whisper of mouth, needing a place to plant and harvest and eat and sleep and weep. A new family was the last thing anyone wanted. None of us could imagine loving again. Could you? That's how it was on the early June day when the two women showed up. Thank you. So, we have some questions for each other. Anybody want to start?
I can start. This is a question for the two of you. You know, I spoke about some of my personal experiences that prompted writing this book. I'm curious what personal experiences and what life experiences you drew on or maybe inspired you to write your novels.
You start.
Well, I was at the first Earth Day celebration in Ann Arbor in 1970, so I've been interested in environmental stuff for a long time. But it really wasn't until my first grandchild was born that I felt it, like really felt. When I tried to imagine what her life might be like as she grew up. at that point, I realized I didn't really know much about climate change, and some friends and I started a study group. This was maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago, 18 years, she's 18, so that's about when we started it. And the more I learned, the more I worried. And my third novel, Kinship of Clover, was born out of that worry. It's mostly about a college student who is so obsessed with disappearing plant species that he starts to hallucinate plants growing in and out of his body. Or maybe they do that, your choice. But I think that for me, that's what has really made me want to write about this. It's really climate change that grabbed me. What about you, Brian?
One of the things that I've thought about for years is how to make activism relevant for younger people, and how to engage younger people into the world of activism. I feel like I've been active my whole life in environmental issues, and how to pass that on. I have no experience in West Virginia doing anything. When I was younger, I would cave and go into West Virginia mountains to go caving there, which was quite exciting. But other than that, my experience is very limited with the topic at hand. But my experience, I think, is valuable in terms of activism and how to prompt and promote activism. I also have, I think I'm sort of 14 years old in my emotional state, so I think I can relate to the angst of growing up, of being a teenager, of being in that in-between stage between the adult world and the kid world, wanting to be a grown-up in so many ways, but not being grown up. One of my favorite books is The Lorax by Dr. Seuss. But when you think about it, there's so much pressure on that one kid. He gets the last seed, the last truffulous seed, and it's completely up to him to save the world. It's like, it's a wonderful book, but that's a lot. It's a lot to put on that one kid. So it's how to share the activism, share the joy in being activism. And now I'm not sure that's answering your question or not, but I'd be curious with you. It seems a very personal book for you because it's named after the field that you were active in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually thought of this character when I was a kid in that field. She was sort of the sort of idealized nature watcher that I imagined in that space, and in some ways she was a spirit of the place, right? Her hair was golden, and that field always turned really this gorgeous honey gold color in the late summer and in the fall, and so I think I kind of embodied that in this fellow child who was exploring and bird watching in this place, because I always had to have these imaginary friends when I was young. And Sammy wasn't my imaginary friend, but she was someone I kind of thought up for that space. And I held on to a lot of things from my childhood for books that I later wanted to write. When I finally turned to this book, I drew a lot from my own experiences of being in nature and watching nature, but definitely Sammy is not me, Bram is not me. They have their own emotional universe going on. But I think that what I really wanted in this book, there's a development plot near the very end. It comes in pretty late, but I didn't want that for this book. I wanted to really encapsulate the joy of being out there and the adventure of exploring nature and discovering things in nature and finding creatures, and first having that be yours and then being able to share that with others. Like over the course of the book, both Sammy and Bram learn how to share the space that they had originally each thought was theirs. First they share it with each other, then they share it with an older naturalist that they discover working there. Then they end up sharing it with the bully at school, who turns out to have his own connection to the space. And then finally, the space becomes a preserve, and they end up sharing it with everyone. And so I think that what you talked about finding community was also a theme I wanted to get across in this book.
Oh, and one thing Naila does is accompany the written text with beautiful sketches of the natural world in Massachusetts, pretty much, that she did herself. It's not, so if you want to take a look at the, and it's really it's really a guide to the natural history of our area in a lot of ways, which is really wonderful. And if I can say one more thing about Naila's book, which I'm more familiar with, is the discovery of nature in the most unnatural places. I mean, the book really begins with the main character, Sammy, going out into what essentially is a junkyard, and there's, rusted automobiles and this and that. But she lifts up this door, this old door that's lying there, and under the door is the usual suspects, a millipede and a centipede and worms, but there's a snake, and there's a snake skin. And it's a sort of a magical moment of discovering the wonder of nature in a junkyard. So it's like, oh, you got to go way out in the woods to find nature. No, you don't. It's right in our backyard. You do a wonderful job in starting with that. Do folks in the audience, do you have questions or comments?
Hillary.
Hold on. Do we pass the mic? Is that what we're supposed to do?
I can speak loud. Well, we have. We'll repeat it. We'll repeat it into. Yeah, we'll repeat it into the mic because of our because of the live stream. Yeah.
So I guess this may be mostly a question for Ellen, given the nature of your book. But I'm curious. The other two of you may have opinions as well. I'm curious as to how you approach the human tendency to sort of accept what is as what has always been. You're such a short-lived species, and I see this even in my own lifetime, natural phenomena that have changed, and people are used to the new baseline. You don't get all the insects, on the windshield, various kinds of, there aren't as many fireflies, that kind of thing. So given that future people have gotten used to that new baseline, how do you in fiction connect the modern reader with that loss that we can see has happened? And I guess this is for Brian too, like, how do we get people to recognize that even though life goes on, there is something that has been lost without succumbing to despair?
Should I repeat it? Yeah. So Hillary's question is this idea that people tend to accept whatever reality they are currently in. And so as the environment changes around us, especially since it's changing slowly, it's really easy to just feel that what we see around us is normal and is what we expect to see, even though our current normal represents this massive swath of loss, right? As Hillary was saying, we don't see the same number of insects on our windshields anymore, and many of the bird species we used to hear around us have gone silent. The biodiversity is less, the abundance is less, and so how do you connect people with that sense of loss through your books? And I think this is a great question for Ellen, because you really talk about folks who see the writing on the wall coming, and in order to see it coming, you have to have a sense also of the past.
It's also a really good question, because I think that anybody who tries to write about environmental issues in any of these ways has to somehow look at the balance between the science and the storytelling. Too much science and you're bogged down, but you need the science as a basis for stories if you're writing about the environment or climate change. But there's another balance as well, and that is the balance between hope and despair. And going, again, too far in one direction or the other doesn't feel honest well, it might be honest to be despairing, but who wants to read a book that's so full of despair that you want to just whatever. I think that that's one of the reasons that I decided to incorporate The Great Undoing. That if there is something that takes us out of our complacency, you know, we are complacent when we see things very gradually change. You know, we may not be happy about it, but it's gradual and you kind of accept it. But if there's a massive event of one kind or another that changes everything, then people are forced to really look at it. You know, as I said before, I wasn't really interested in writing a dystopic novel about one disaster after another, but I wanted the disaster to be there because it is what forces the characters to figure out how we might, in fact, live much better on the earth. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, Hillary and everyone else, I worry about that so much. Look what's happening with Trump. It's like the new normal. Oh, yeah, you know, we're bombing boats with survivors in Venezuela. Oh, yeah, now we're at war with Iran. Oh, yeah, what's the next thing? And it's shocking how complacent we become as this new norm, as the goalpost keeps switching, to be footballish, I guess, about it. And that's so disturbing. And it's true with environmental stuff too, right? Oh yeah, there are less insects. Oh well, what's the next environmental? Oh yeah, you know, the oil pipelines coming in. Oh yeah, it's climate change. Oh yeah, it's degradation of the landscape. And how to recognize that that's not normal and that's not acceptable. It just isn't. When it's easy to just be, it's so easy to fall into complacency because activism is an antidote to despair, but it also takes a lot of work to be an activist. And I do worry about that. And like Ellen was saying, I also worry about with fiction, how do you write, how do you present serious environmental topics without, in ways that don't propel people to throw themselves off cliffs? And to bring the joy out in activism while bringing this realization that it is not acceptable to continue on this path, whether it's a political landscape or an environmental landscape.
Yeah, I actually do have an answer to that question as well. You know, I think for me, that question is maybe one of the reasons I really like writing fiction about nature for children, because I think that having a baseline at all starts with loving what's there. And I think that if children don't feel a connection to the nature that's in front of them, whatever baseline they're starting from, they won't have the information they need to see it slip away. And I think that the experience of seeing it slip away in front of you as you get older is what triggers you to understand how much has been lost before your lifetime as well. Like if you can see it happening now, then you'll have some sort of gauge to recognize, you know, I mean, I saw this incredible film when I was volunteering at the Seattle Aquarium, and I've searched for this film and I cannot find it, but I know it's called Shifting Baselines. And I think that's the problem. The name is too ubiquitous for me to find the actual film, but it showed what the salmon harvest was like when the indigenous people of that region were still subsistence fishing for salmon. And I mean, it was just, I mean, my jaw was like trailing away, you know, millions of miles behind me. There was so much abundance. They would just take a hand net and they would put it into the water from these scaffolds that they would build alongside the river. And when they would pull it up, there'd be like 2 or 3 gigantic salmon in it. There was that much abundance in that river. And I think knowing the salmon of that region myself, having seen them, having been around them, having visited the Ballard Locks and seen them coming up, or gone up to Alaska doing field work and seeing the fish in the river there, it gave me a sense of the magnitude of difference, even though what I saw was already abundant, and I'm already afraid to lose that. And then seeing that made me realize the magnitude of what we've lost out here, where there aren't any salmon in the rivers at all. There used to be salmon here, right? We used to have salmon runs on the Northeast. They are gone. And so, yeah, I think that just getting children to be in nature, to love nature, to experience nature, starts giving them the opportunity to understand what a baseline even is. And I'll add, too, that one of my proudest types of feedback, I've gotten it a couple times for this book, is when kids reach out to me and they say, your book makes me want to find my own wing haven. And it's just like, that is such a wonderful feeling to know that there are kids out there like looking for their own wing haven, so that they can have that connection, with nature. Other questions? Yeah.
One thing I've been thinking a lot is, to have some more positive impacts to the environment, the political landscape. I think we might have to make a very large collective, action to change our own consumption behavior. And I guess in terms of writing fiction about that, that sounds pretty stressful and boring. Maybe it could be fun, but I think that's sort of the dilemma I see. The reality of trying to change how the world is going would require us to question and change our own consumption behavior, and that just doesn't seem like a for a good fiction. And actually, if you are running for office and you say, we don't want to have Jimmy Carter, you say, oh, we got to conserve. That's basically a kiss of death for the movie, actually. And I guess that's my dilemma. If you want to express some of the ideas in fiction, specifically reduction of diesel consumption, I don't see a good way to sell that.
Sure, yeah, I can repeat that. So the question was that in terms of changing our impact on the environment, one really important aspect of that seems to be changing our own consumption patterns, and diminishing our consumption, and being less resource heavy, right? Less consumptive in general. And so how do you approach a theme like that in fiction when it's such an unpleasant thing to have to contemplate, right? Nobody wants to consume less or have less or own less or be less comfortable. And it's also, it can also be a very boring theme, like very bureaucratic and, just reduce your consumption. And so how do you approach that in fiction? Again, Ellen, I think your book kind of touches on this, so maybe you could start.
As I mentioned before, I don't think fiction usually does such a great job at giving a blueprint for behavior. Fiction's not great at giving answers. It's really good at asking the questions, at asking the reader to think about, these young people with how are they going to stop the destruction of the mountain or something like that. So I think the question becomes coming up with a storyline in which characters must respond in some way, not because they're feeling really, you don't want them to be judgy, right? Because nobody likes to be preached at, nobody likes to be lectured to. So, and often people don't change in big ways unless we're forced to. It's just, it seems to be part of the inertia of at least adulthood, maybe not with children. So I think you pose a really interesting question, how can you put your characters in a situation in which they must figure out how to change for whatever external or internal reasons they're in that position. I can think of nonfiction books that I've read that do a really good job of talking about how to reduce our carbon footprint, how to reuse in all sorts of ways. But it's really tricky in fiction. People read fiction for the story and the characters and to escape feeling judged or lectured at. So if you figure that out, I'd love to know.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading your book when it comes out. Is it the end of the month? Is the end of the month is when your book is coming out? We only have a week, so yeah, get cranking.
I have a comment. So, Ellen, your book with the enclave of people that move into the interior, is there any this sort of thing happening there where they arrive there and realize what is happening in the world, and we have to immediately look for food, look for water, live bare minimum because we don't have the things to have them.
Yeah, the question is so that when people move to this homestead, is there that sense of not having enough and of having to find things? When they move there in this book, it's Maine, and there are grocery stores, and they can still, if they don't object, they can get Amazon products delivered maybe the next day. It's not until after the climate disaster that things fall apart to the extent of people having to say, well, what are we going to use for toilet paper? How does anybody know how to make soap? There's no hospital nearby. What if somebody has appendicitis? And so that question of how it's almost like returning to a pre-industrial society. I'll just share that one thing that changed my behavior as I was writing this book was I realized that I had very few skills that would be useful in this situation. I called my friend Jane and said, I want to learn how to knit. I want to know how to do something really useful that might be helpful. That was something that was doable, luckily. But I think that one of the things I hope to do with the book is make people think about that. What if we didn't have all of these things that we are totally dependent on? Even just the internet. Most people bank and do everything online. What if the internet, if it entirely failed? It could.
And I think there is this conversation going on around technology. Like you look at cell phones now. People are saying, no, kids should not have access to social media until they're 14 or 16 years old. No, cell phones should not be allowed in schools. That impedes the ability of kids to interact with each other in the hallway, to interact in the classroom, for teaching and learning to happen. AI now is the same conversation. This massive influx of energy and water just to keep it going. Do we need it? And maybe there is hope in that this conversation is saying, people are stepping back and saying, no, I don't want social media. No, I don't want cell phone use. No, I don't want AI to tell me how to do everything. So I don't know, maybe there's hope in that.
Yeah, I think, we sort of started out this panel talking a little bit about, Priya was mentioning the power of the imagination, right? And I think that one thing I enjoyed about Ellen's book, especially at the beginning before anything happens, is the family is starting this homestead in the middle of Maine, and they're already starting to imagine what they might need if there's a climate disaster, right? So they're already, they're asking the teenagers of the family to each take a vegetable that they're going to be in charge of. So this kid who really doesn't want to move into the boonies of Maine is in charge of the tomatoes, right? And I think that by romanticizing these, I think fiction has the power to romanticize the ideal, right? So we can romanticize, well, what would it be like to homestead in a place where you're sort of trying to be forward-thinking about the new climate reality? Or what might it be like to be an activist trying to stop mountaintop removal? And I think if we introduce these imaginary possibilities to readers and present them as something that is exciting to their sense of possibility, then we open their desire to try new things. We open the possibility of experiencing those things in the future. I mean, we know, for example, that there's like this whole movement to have a disaster kit now, right? Like everyone's kind of worried and everyone's creating these disaster kits in their basement. I think if we start imagining a future and we start putting it into place, even in really small ways, you know, if there's some people who are homesteading because they're scared of a climate future, if there's some people who have moved to solar because they think it's the right thing to do, right? If there's some institutions that decide they're going to put in geothermal heat pumps, these little bits of social imagination are the seed material that can help when we do have the great undoing and suddenly everybody needs to be doing that, right? Like I feel like we need to put these possibilities into place so that they're available to us when we need to scale them up. And I think fiction does a good job of that, of imagining the possible, imagining what could be, creating romantic ideals for people to try to live up to. You know, I don't know that fiction does much, but I do think it does that. It gives people, it's not even hope, it's like energy. It's like, yes, that could be me, right? Like identifying with the protagonist is a really powerful force in our lives.
I'm watching Priya in the background. Are we overstepping our time?
No, you're good. I have a question. No one else does.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, so I've been reading a lot of science fiction lately, the kind where folks are out in deep space looking for a new home. And the feeling that I am struck with is a lot of nostalgia for an Earth that was and hunting for a new Earth that is like the Earth that was. There's a lot of, oh, well, you know, the sky is not quite the same color that we're used to, or the grass isn't really grass. And I just feel a lot of like preemptive nostalgia. And after reading those books, I have to remind myself, like, no, I still live here. This stuff is still here. So I would like, if you can share your recommendations for your favorite places around here that can sort of take us out of the like, you know, climate disaster, future, emergency. No, it's still here, and you can enjoy the beauty and the grace of it. Somewhere where I can go touch grass.
Should I repeat that? Okay, so Priya is asking us, she's saying that she's been reading a lot of science fiction lately where there's a lot of, I think that's a lovely phrase, preemptive nostalgia for the Earth that was, right? Where there's folks trying to make a new life on another planet, but they're missing the Earth that they used to love and the color of the grass and the particular way the waters were and so forth. And the Priya was saying she has to remind herself, I am still on Earth. It is still here. We haven't lost it. So she's asking if we have recommendations for places here on Earth right now in Western Massachusetts where people can go to touch grass and reconnect with the Earth that we still fortunately have with us.
I think that probably most of us live in Western Mass because we have these natural places all around us. We have, you know, even if you live in town, you drive 5 miles out of that town and there's an Audubon trail or a state forest, a little bit farther for the state forest, but that's why we live here, because we can have some good restaurants and the culture, but also be in the woods very, very quickly.
I think it's useful to remind ourselves what Western Massachusetts was 200 years ago. There wasn't a tree. There weren't deer or turkey or bear. It was a deforested, de-wilded landscape, which is really interesting. And also, I mean, there's much less population, obviously, and much less environmental pressures in some ways. But, you know, you couldn't drink the water. In certain cases, you couldn't breathe the air. The Connecticut River, up until the 1970s, was the most beautifully sewer in the country. I mean, environmental regulations have helped tremendously. Nature abhors a vacuum, which is very comforting to know, no matter how much we fuck things up. Excuse my language, Priya. Nature will come back, with or without us. There will be a vibrant, biologically diverse Earth. And that's sort of comforting, right? I mean, we can screw it up, but only to a certain extent. Things will bounce back. It may bounce back without us. But I think of when, Priya, in terms of your question, I mean, one place that, and again, back to why we live here, is our farms. You know, these are beautiful opportunities. People are trying to farm in ecological ways that reduce impact on the environment. And we're just surrounded by these small farms that are just so marvelous places of beauty and diversity. And I think of Grow Food Northampton, which is really looking at riparian restoration for the Mill River, having these vibrant small small incubator farms, as well as community garden spots. You look at Northampton. We preserved, I think, 30%, close to 30% of our land now in Northampton is in the public domain, locked up, and a conservation area available to just about everyone within ability to walk or bike ride there, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, I love how your comment about what Massachusetts used to be also reminds us that shifting baselines can go the other way, right? That sometimes we can forget how important the regulations we put in place were to restoring some of the natural environments that we see now. But sort of back to Priya's question, I think one of the things I really wanted to get across in this book, and that I feel is so important, is just the reminder that, like, nature, I think we often think of nature as like, oh, I'm going to go to a beautiful beach, or I'm going to go to a gorgeous mountaintop, or I'm going to go to this spectacular place and I'm going to be in nature. And I think that's important, and those places are wonderful, and, you know, you can go out west and find these massive natural environments that are completely unspoiled and really grandiose. But I think a lot of times nature is about, like, hanging out there until you see it. Like, you can go on the bike trail and not see it. You know, you can go. I've been hiking on Mount Tom recently, and the way I've been going, I've been walking my sister's dog, helping walk my sister's dog, and the way I've been going is just like I go up a neighborhood street, and at the end of the street there's this little tiny cul-de-sac, and you park the car, and you go up this fairly nondescript chunk of forest, and you end up on a fairly nondescript gravel path, and then you keep going, and you end up on a fairly nondescript top area with a lookout tower and a stone house and a children's playground. And you can see it as being just plain old forest, or you can pay attention. And, you know, I was watching my 6-year-old drawing leaves, and, you know, and then you go up on the lookout tower and you really look and you breathe and you watch the trees sway and you just pay attention to those little things, and eventually it just starts to change the way you feel. And being in the fresh air changes the way you feel, and seeing the trees changes the way you feel, and sitting next to some little mountain brook that's coming down the side of the mountain and listening to the water changes the way your brain functions. And there's so much research that says that just being outside in any way, it alters our health, it improves our health. And so remembering that nature is really, it's really right there. It's all around us. We can spot it anywhere. Greg Salmon is this incredible local reporter and photographer who photographs urban birds. And, you know, he can just find amazing birds anywhere and produce those photographs and show you their lives. You know, you can put up a bird feeder in your window and there they are. You know, it's really everywhere. And having an eye for the little things is as important as taking the time to discover where are the places with big nature close to me that where I can really go and see no one and be in a pristine environment.
Naila talks about her 6-year-old. My wife and I just came back from Salt Lake City visiting our 2-year-old grandson. It's his second birthday. And we go out for a little walk with him, and it was like, rock. And, we're on this path, and we'd stop for 15 minutes because there were these tiny little rocks. And he's like, butterfly. A little moth comes down, and it's like, oh my God, this is the most wonderful thing ever. And we get about 6 steps is the walk, and I came back saying I'm going to look at the world through a 2-year-old's eyes, where everything is wonderful and everything is magical. And I can still fall apart and scream for 30 minutes. Everyone will be like, oh, yeah. But anyway, it's back to what Naila is saying. It's the wonder of the beauty of the world close by. And Salt Lake City, I mean, it's the most beautiful mountains in the world out there. And
I will say one more thing in terms of being able to see the things in nature that you might have missed and the sort of the healing power of that. Like going on an Audubon field trip or like a Kestrel field trip or Hampshire Bird Club trip and being with people who are in nature all the time and know what to look for can be really transformative too. It's a really wonderful way of experiencing what's out there because those are people who they know what to look for, they can spot it, they can take you to the right places. I've spent a lot of time on those kinds of field trips and they're really wonderful. Yeah, I thought of that because I was remembering a colleague of mine when I was working in Southeast Alaska, gorgeous environment, right? And one of my colleagues got fascinated by the mosses. And she would bring home, she would bring to our bed and breakfast where we were staying when we were doing field work, she would bring home this pile of mosses, and then she would lay them all out on the table and separate them into these minuscule categories. And then she'd be there with all her books, looking at 50 mosses that all looked exactly the same as one another. That's that kind of attention, right? That's finding those tiny little rocks and being able to really appreciate and enjoy them. Nature has so many different scales, and I think that's a really wonderful way of training your attention.
Any last questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being